Egyptian pharaohs didn't conquer with armies, they conquered with grain. Control the food supply, and you don't need soldiers. You just need to be willing to let people starve. China currently holds 51% of the world's wheat in strategic reserves. That's not surplus, that's a weapon. And the trap that enslaved ancient Egypt for 3,000 years just went global. Let's start with what made Egypt different. The Nile flooded like clockwork every summer, depositing fertile black silt across the delta. Grain grew in absurd abundance. Egypt could feed its entire population for a year and still have surplus rotting in warehouses. Egyptians should have been the freest people alive. Instead, they became prisoners of the most sophisticated dependency trap in human history. Because here's what the pharaohs understood: control the necessities, and you control everything else. 7 massive circular silos at Tel Edfu stood 25 feet tall. The Ramesseum held 40,000 sacks minimum. These weren't just storage facilities, they were instruments of absolute power. While the state built infrastructure capable of surviving decades-long famines, ordinary citizens couldn't store grain themselves at scale. The technology, the land rights, the security, all monopolized. Sound familiar? Most developed nations now import over 50% of their staple grains. Egypt, the country that once fed the Roman Empire, imports 85% of its wheat. Lebanon imports 90%. These aren't efficiency improvements. They're the systematic dismantling of food sovereignty in favor of import dependency. Countries abandon local farming capacity, then discover they're trapped. The ancient Egyptian system was elegant in its brutality. The state collected 10 to 60% of every harvest as taxation. Workers received zero currency, only grain rations. Temple complexes owned up to 18% of all farmland. Most workers received exactly what they'd consume: 10 loaves of bread plus 2 jugs of beer daily for standard laborers. Even elite craftsmen at Deir el Medina, who built royal tombs, received measured monthly rations: 300 liters of wheat, 110 liters of barley. Enough to live, never enough to accumulate real independence. The system created the illusion of prosperity while engineering absolute dependency, and for over 1,000 years it worked flawlessly, until the Nile stopped flooding. From 2181 to 2040 BCE, the river that had sustained Egyptian civilization failed for 300 consecutive years. Egypt, the world's superpower, fractured into 42 competing warlord territories overnight. The inscriptions from this period read like horror stories. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, people eating their children, reads Anktifi of Mu'allah's tomb. Archaeological records document systematic cannibalism throughout the former kingdom. Anktifi posted armed guards on grain bins, erected dams to control irrigation, forbade people from leaving his territory. His proudest boast wasn't military conquest or architectural achievement, it was preventing his people from eating each other. That's what happens when a dependency trap collapses. Not revolution, not reform, starvation. And worse. Fast forward to 2022, Sri Lanka couldn't afford grain imports. They exhausted their strategic reserves within months. The government collapsed. Citizens stormed the presidential palace. Egyptian workers in 1170 BCE couldn't survive 1 week without grain payments. Sri Lankan citizens in 2022 couldn't survive 3 months without grain imports. The mechanism is identical. Only the scale has changed. But Egypt's collapse taught its survivors something valuable: how to build an even more sophisticated trap. When the kingdom reunified around 2040 BCE, the new pharaohs implemented a system so advanced it would dominate the ancient world for the next 2,000 years. They had learned from catastrophe. Egypt operated entirely cashless until 525 BCE. Grain was money. Workers depended on grain payments whether they worked or not. Grain loans charged 100% yearly interest. Miss a payment? Forced labor. Can't pay taxes? Conscription building pyramids. The psychological weapon was complete. You couldn't opt out. Desert bordered Egypt on both sides. You were geographically trapped in a civilization designed to make you dependent on pharaonic grain payments for survival. The United States weaponized the same logic during the Cold War. The Food for Peace program was explicitly described as an arm of foreign policy. President Lyndon Johnson implemented short tether policy, month-to-month grain contracts designed to extract political concessions. During India's 1960s famine, Johnson told advisors, "I'm not going to give them food unless they do what I want." Control the food, control the people. The pharaohs knew it, Johnson knew it, and every government since has played the same game. In 1170 BCE, during year 29 of Ramesses III's reign, administrative payments were delayed by just 1 week. The entire Deir el Medina workforce, elite craftsmen who carved royal tombs, went on strike. These weren't ordinary laborers. They were among the highest skilled, best compensated workers in the kingdom, and they couldn't survive 7 days without state grain distribution. History's first recorded labor strike wasn't about wages or working conditions. It was about survival. That strike revealed the system's weakness. It worked perfectly until the moment it didn't. But the pharaohs had a solution for that too. They turned Egypt's grain monopoly into an external weapon. Between 1250 and 1100 BCE, a devastating mega-drought struck the Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire began to collapse. Civilizations throughout the region faced systematic crop failures. Egypt didn't just survive this crisis, they had prepared for it. During the worst drought conditions, from 1198 to 1196 BCE, Hittite Queen Pudahepa wrote desperately to Egyptian pharaohs, "I have no grain in my lands." The most powerful woman in the Hittite Empire was begging Egypt for food. Egypt's response revealed the true sophistication of their system. They shipped exactly 15 tons of grain to the dying Hittites, not enough to solve the crisis, but enough to extract maximum concessions. The price? Silver, luxury goods, territorial rights, and complete political submission. This wasn't charity, it was weaponized famine. In 2022, Russia blocked Ukrainian grain exports to pressure African nations diplomatically. Same weapon, different century. While neighboring countries burned through reserves, the nation controlling supply extracted political concessions. The trap works because it exploits the most basic human need. People can negotiate over wages, over borders, over ideology. They cannot negotiate over starvation. But Egypt's grain weapon proved so effective that when Egypt itself eventually fell to conquest, the new rulers didn't destroy the system. They perfected it. Rome conquered Egypt in 27 BCE for one explicit reason. Feeding their own population had become impossible without Egyptian grain. By the 2nd century CE, Egyptian wheat fed over 1 million Romans through the Annona, a massive free grain distribution program. Ships carrying 40 tons each sailed in constant convoys between Alexandria and Rome. 320,000 adult male citizens received free monthly grain rations. Roman officials were explicit about the program's purpose. As they documented, hunger could lead to unrest and rebellion. Feed the mob or lose your head. Rome had refined Egypt's model for imperial scale. The Annona created urban dependency that prevented revolt. But Rome didn't control grain production directly. They imported it from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The entire empire's stability depended on maintaining these supply lines. The weakness was terminal. When Vandal forces captured North African grain provinces in 439 CE, Rome didn't have centuries to adapt like Egypt during the first intermediate period. They had one generation. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, 37 years after losing control of their grain supply. Control the food, control the people. Lose the food, lose everything. Today, the pattern operates at planetary scale. China holds 51% of global wheat reserves and 69% of global corn. This isn't accidental surplus, it's strategic positioning. The same logic that drove pharaonic silo construction now operates worldwide. And here's what makes this immediately dangerous. Most nations have systematically dismantled their food sovereignty in favor of efficiency. Why grow grain domestically when you can import it cheaper from industrial agricultural systems? But that logic ignores the strategic vulnerability it creates. One supply disruption, pandemic, war, climate failure, or deliberate export restriction, and modern governments face the same choice as Anktify of Mo'ala: maintain order while people starve, or watch civilization collapse. The pattern repeats because it works. Create absolute dependency on a critical resource, monopolize the infrastructure needed to store or produce that resource independently. Design distribution systems that prevent the accumulation of meaningful reserves, then leverage that dependency for total control. But recognizing the pattern provides power to counter it. Ask 3 questions about any system you depend on. Who controls the storage and supply of the critical resource? Can individuals build meaningful reserves independently, or is the infrastructure monopolized? What happens if payments or supply stops for 1 week? If the answers are centralized institutions, no, an immediate crisis. You're inside a dependency trap. The pharaohs controlled Egypt for 3,000 years using grain dependency. Modern governments learned from them. The only difference is scale. Now it's global, and one supply shock affects billions instead of millions. But every empire that relied on this system eventually collapsed. Rome, Egypt, all of them. The trap works until enough people recognize it and build alternatives. then it fails. You're not powerless against historical patterns. You're educated about them. Build household reserves of staple foods. Hold assets that can't be frozen or devalued by centralized authorities. Learn production skills that reduce your dependency on complex supply chains. Most importantly, understand that convenience often means dependency. The Annona was convenient too, right until it wasn't. History provided the warning. What you do next is up to you. If you want to see what's coming, hit subscribe. History has the receipts. I'll show you where they're hidden.